Yeah, so welcome everybody to today's Pathways seminar. I'm Laurence Smith. I'm co-coordinator of Pathways together with Harry Blockhouse and Dinah Libera at SLU. I'd just like to say a really warm welcome to Nikki Yoxall, who's the Research Manager and Scotland Regional Facilitator at Pasture For Life, one of our industry partners within Pathways. And yeah, Nikki is a smallholder farmer as well as being the research manager within the PFLA. So it's based in Aberdeenshire, and she's also working on a PhD at CCRI, a research institute in the southwest of England. And before moving to Scotland, Nikki was head of land-based studies at a college in southeast of England, overseeing a range of rural programs, and also engaged with the university in Highlands and Islands. And she, as I say, she manages a herd of native Shetland cattle, which have been expanded to include other native breeds on top of everything else that Nikki's doing. So, thank you very much for joining us today, Nikki. And Lisa Norton will be joining us in a bit, hopefully. Just to say, Lisa is a agroecologist and senior scientist at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and she was the principal investigator on the SEEGSLIP project, which was investigating the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association and its members. A lot of the ideas from SEEGSLIP have sort of flowed into Pathways, and Lisa was really instrumental in helping us develop the application. So yeah, without further ado, I'll hand over to Nikki. So thank you again.
Thanks, Laurence. I think I can share my screen, so just bear with me a second. When I get that open. Okay. Can you see that?
Yeah, it's not in presentation mode yet. Could you?
I have put it in. It might just take a minute. I'll turn my camera off because my internet's a bit rubbish.
Yeah,
how's that?
Yeah, that's in presentation now. Yeah, thanks.
Cool. Excellent. So yeah, I'm going to give a very brief overview of Pasture for Life, just to give you some context before Lisa takes over and talks about some of the findings from the SEEGSLIP project. And we also had been working with Gillian Butler on the SUSCAP project as well over the last few years, that was primarily focusing on nutritional value of 100% pasture-fed meat and dairy products. And I guess I wanted to take the opportunity to also share with you some of the types of systems that you might find on Pasture for Life farms. So I'm conscious we don't have much time, so this is a much condensed version of what I would normally do. But essentially, Pasture for Life champion the restorative power of grazing animals on pasture, and we advocate for a future where grazing animals, so ruminants, eat only their natural diet, which is pasture, and play a positive ecological role in our landscapes. And we have 25 biodiversity case studies from across our membership, which I'd always be happy to share with you to highlight the work that many of our farmers are doing in terms of biodiversity benefits as part of the farm system. We do a lot of work around to support kind of environmental, animal and human health, as well as being very much in support of a thriving rural economy and a wider sustainable food system. So we promote agroecological or agroecology as a concept, although many of our farmers would probably use the term regenerative grazing. And we work very much as a member-led organisation. So we've been around for about 12 years now. 3/4 of our members are farmers. Anyone can be a member, so academics, vets, chefs, retailers, and we're a not-for-profit. So our membership means that we're literally very much grounded, and we often are the kind of go-to organisation for ruminant grazing in the UK. We have about 900 members, of which we have a very high retention rate, and 150, I think actually 160 certified farms. And the products that we certify are meat, dairy products, wool, and also leather. And we certify across cattle, so both for beef and dairy, sheep, and also venison. So we certify deer as well, and we also certify goats. So basically any ruminants that are being produced in the UK, we are certifying and supporting. We're kind of built in three pillars. So we have certification. So we offer 100% pasture-fed certification standard. We also offer the second pillar is community. So we do a lot of work with our members, farm walks, events, taster events, visits. webinar series every winter. So we do a lot of work in terms of building that movement. And then credibility, which is my role as head of research. I oversee and support the kind of work with academics to actually give our work credibility, but we also do quite a lot of field trials and farmer-led studies as well. And so I just want to go through some of the types of systems, the system practices that you might find on Pasture for Life farms. I haven't included conservation grazing because that's something that we know there is already quite a lot of research on. But some of these other practices, you know, I would say there's a lack of peer-reviewed literature, particularly in a UK context, and it's something that we're always sort of supporting and supportive of and encouraging academics to explore in more detail. So the first one would be adaptive multi-paddock, so AMP or mob grazing, various terms used interchangeably by different people, but generally what we would be saying here is that this is high density, short pulses of grazing, followed by much longer rest periods, usually 45 days plus. And this has been found in a study that was done with Rothamsted by Sarah Morgan, who's now at Harper Adams, that it increased the carrying capacity and the grazing season was extended. So there are definite kind of improvements that can be made to the output, whilst the individual animal daily live weight gain doesn't always make the same increases. Actually, you can have more animals, so thereby kind of from a profitability point of view actually is beneficial. And this kind of multi-paddock grazing means that in one field, for example, where that increased rest is made available, the things that aren't generally kind of considered in much of the modelling work that I've seen is that field is ready to graze after 45 days, whereas if they were set stocked, you'd have to move them out of there, for example. So it definitely means that you can change the way that you're managing land. It can also lead to improved outwintering, which again is something, kind of wintering systems are pretty under-researched and are not very easy to model. And we also find that these approaches quite often what we see is stocking rate and stocking density are used interchangeably, but they are actually two very different things, which I can talk about later if that's useful. The other thing that I feel is kind of that we see a lot, particularly on our mixed farms, our mixed certified farms, is this idea of integration. So often mixed farms have cattle over here or sheep over here, and then they have arable going on somewhere else. But we know that our farmers are very much integrating these animals into the same area of land. So, for example, this means that one field can produce as much as 3 different food harvests a year. So, for example, you might plant a winter wheat, which would get grazed off in spring by sheep or young stock, so cattle young stock, which reduces the need for fungicide and also reduces the need for nitrogen fertilizer. So you get that, for example, sheep output from that first graze. You then harvest your wheat, so you get a cereal crop. You then put in a cover crop and get your cattle to graze that, so you then get beef. So off that same field, you're getting contribution to 3 different food outputs in 1 year, and often that isn't taken into account when we're thinking about land use. And I'd say that the additional public goods of having, for example, living roots in the ground, more photosynthesis happening because you've got cover crops or you've got active growing happening earlier in the year are also things that are not necessarily taken into account, but these have significant implications, particularly as part of a kind of agroecological future. And then the third one is silvopasture. There's some, you'll all know, brilliant research, particularly in the tropical areas around how silvopasture can be really beneficial, and there is increasing amount of silvopasture, and you know the likes of Tim Pagella and Lindsay Wistance are doing fantastic work on this. But I think quite often the functional benefits are misunderstood or not fully understood, and the implications that has for the reduced need for other inputs. So, for example, these are photos of my cattle, and we don't use any wormers at all. We're undertaking fecal egg counts regularly throughout the year, and because we're doing that, because of the silvopasture and the frequent moves, that is having a significant implication for what inputs we need to buy, which obviously has an impact on our carbon audit, for example, but also wider biodiversity benefits. So again, these sorts of systems are obviously having benefit, but I don't think we're capturing that particularly well. I'm going to stop there because I think we probably want to hear more from Lisa rather than me talking about some of these things. How do I stop sharing? There we go. And so I guess I just wanted to give you that context for then understanding the types of systems that we're working with, that then Lisa might be able to talk in more detail about findings from the SEEGSLIP project. I really did fly through that, didn't I, in 10 minutes? Sorry. And has Lisa joined us?
Yeah, just checking to see if Lisa's here now. So thank you very much, Nikki, for that. And yeah, if you could send us the slides if possible afterwards, we can make those available as well on the shared space. So is Lisa with us now? Okay, possibly not.
Okay, well, shall I ask? I can answer any questions if we're still waiting for Lisa.
Yeah,
and
maybe,
that's
a good
and then Laurence, maybe you can talk through some of the stuff because you were involved in SEEGSLIP as well. Sorry, just to throw that on you. But shall I answer?
Yeah, sure.
Shall I answer any questions that folk might have?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. So if you've got a question, if you can raise your hand, and then Joshua, if you can manage the hands, as it were, in the chat, and any questions as comments, I'll just dig out my SEEGSLIP slides. Thanks.
I think Clara has a hand. Do you want to?
Yes, I mean, thanks a lot for the presentation. It's a very interesting project, and we are also working quite a bit on, yes, grazing livestock and so on. So I was wondering if you had also any, or if you've done any research or measurements regarding carbon sequestration with the grazing animals. I think that would be very interesting because, I mean, as most of you know, livestock farming is most of the time we are really confronted with the issue that because of the greenhouse gas emissions, it's really considered having a heavily negative impact on climate. But we actually have now also done a few studies with some experts that show that if you have grazing animals, actually it can reverse this negative impact. So I was wondering if it's something that you looked at or you're planning to look at. I think that would be very interesting.
Yeah, so because we're not a research institute, we rely on you guys, or all of you who are, to do that for us, and we want to work with you to support that work to happen. So we have lots of farmers who want to be able to offer their farms for those sorts of actual in-field studies. And again, that comes back to this issue that quite often some of the grazing practices, for example, that have been assessed. So the study that I talked about that Sarah Morgan had done, they were looking at soil carbon levels in relation to mob versus set stocked grazing systems, but the system doesn't really replicate our farms, because actually those animals were just brought in for that very short experimental period and then taken away again and fed grain, for example. They're finished as dairy beef. So it's very difficult for us, though we can take learnings from those sorts of studies. It's difficult for us to kind of quantify that or understand how that would look in an entirely pasture-fed system. There are a number of PhDs that are being done at the moment in Scotland that are looking at carbon sequestration under mob grazing. And I would suggest that, and I know that actually, well, when Lisa does join us, there is Cranfield University had taken a lot of our member farms statistics and their kind of financial statistics and their system statistics to undertake that modelling. So that's definitely something that we are waiting for results from. And I would also say, I can see Bill probably wants to come in and comment, because Bill is very much involved in Pasture for Life and is certified, has been involved with Pasture for Life for a long time. I think the other thing is also about the emissions. We are very concerned as an organisation that the emissions that are being used in the modelling kind of systems don't necessarily, I'm not confident that they reflect the types of animals that we see primarily on our farms, just because most of our farms are breeding a smaller animal. They're going for smaller frame size, and they're going for like high rumen function. And I'm not convinced that what we're seeing is accurate. And I know that Hannah Davis at Newcastle has been doing some work on this, and recently submitted a paper to a journal, and got a bit of pushback because what they were actually measuring was quite different to the assumptions that had previously been made. Bill, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. Just to say that my wife and I farm cattle in Cumbria, and we have a very extensive system involving a lot of semi-natural habitats, grassland, heath, and woodland, delivering conservation objectives. So we began to get troubled by this issue when people who we thought should be supporting this kind of grazing were beginning to make reference to the fact that they were worried about using cattle to do this type of grazing because of the emissions that they produce. And so about 12, 13 years ago, we did our own assessment carbon audit using several different tools that were available at the time, the main one of which came from DEFRA, the government body responsible. And when we used their tool, which didn't take account of any sequestration, then we had a very bad emissions result. When we used other tools that did include sequestration, both soil and biomass, then we were very much negative emitters. And so ever since then, we've been engaged in this struggle to try and persuade anyone who'll listen that unless we come up with a really comprehensive system for accounting for these emissions, then we're likely to end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because obviously biodiversity is something we can't afford to lose any more than our climate stability. So it's a really big issue, and Nikki and I and the other members of the research group at Pasture for Life spend most of our time discussing this issue. So it will be interesting to go into more detail at some stage with this group when we have more of a chance.
I believe Simon has his hand up.
I think Simon, sorry.
Yeah, I think that the trouble is that a lot of these calculators just take standard values and they just say, okay, well, this is an adult cow and it's assumed to be 600, 700 kilos, and they just do a standard emission. But if you take into account of body weight, then the emissions should be, they're actually accounted for in dry matter intake. You should be taking account of dry matter intake and digestibility when you're taking this kind of tier 2, borderline tier 3 approach. The trouble is most calculators are designed to fit with many different farms, farm types, and so they don't go into any detail for any specific things. We're hoping that in Pathways we can give you a better calculation for at least one of the farms through task 5.3. And it should take account of the smaller cattle, if they are smaller, the size, the dry matter intake. The question can be the quality of the intake. What is the digestibility and so on, because obviously the lower digestibility, in theory, there's more methane emissions. This is what's generally proven when they do these feeding trials and so on. So that's an interesting factor. But they're also, like the pictures of the silver pasture, if they're getting browse off trees and so on, then there's tannins in those, and tannins are a known inhibitor of methane. So, and if your pasture is dotted with trees, with shrubs, things like this, then you're offsetting the methane emissions with the biomass sequestration. And probably due to the grassland management, you're also getting root sequestration, below ground sequestration as well. So I can understand in a relatively extensive system, probably requiring intensive management, but relatively extensive, then you should probably be, it wouldn't surprise me if you're carbon neutral or carbon negative. You haven't got the external inputs either. So you're not buying feed. You're not buying fertilizer or very much anyway. So yeah, your inputs will be very low. So the external side, the inputs kind of to the factory, in inverted commas, will be very low from that side. It's most of your emissions will be the methane, but getting that calculated is what doesn't generally happen very well in many models at the moment. But we're hoping to give you a better quality assessment. But I think I'm also having a meeting with you on Friday with the PFLA, so we'll discuss more there.
Thanks, Simon. I think you're right, and it was really interesting that one of the things is when so many of our farmers are grazing permanent pasture, there is lots more bird's foot trefoil present, because obviously there are issues with persistence of bird's foot trefoil, for example. So quite often folk that are adding them into sort of a herbal ley or a multi-species sward, they just don't persist because they're a cultivar that struggles. Whereas if you just change your grazing management so that you can support and encourage those plants in their natural environment to flower, and we're then seeing a much higher consumption of high tannin plants, not just from trees but also from what's in the sward. I remember having a conversation with a colleague at SIUC who suggested that bird's foot trefoil was all very, very well and good, but did we have a way of kind of harvesting it so we could feed it to the cattle? And I did have to remind him that, you know, they have their own mouths and they have their own legs and it could just be taken to the plant to eat it. So I think, yeah, I worry that sometimes we go down these kind of very extractive ideas of how we should be addressing these issues rather than thinking to more naturalized systems. And there was just one other thing that you mentioned about kind of extensive systems. And again, I think there's something about, you know, we have this binary of intensive and extensive, and I spend a lot of time on farms that sit somewhere very much between those. And, you know, a lot of the characteristics of the farm would often be associated with extensive in that they have very low inputs. They don't have low output though. And, you know, we've got to find a better way of, instead of making these assumptions that, for example, organic or extensive systems have lower output, or that they, you know, that there is this kind of binary approach, because it's a much more complex spectrum than that. And it definitely feels like within the farm, for farmers' perspective, that we're almost been kind of positioned against each other rather than understanding the complexities of the spectrum. I don't know, Bill, you had your hand up, but I think Pietro wanted to come in with a comment or a question.
Well, mine is a little bit a comment. Of course, unfortunately, in the past, very little has been counted regarding the grassland system, grassland management, and the effect on soil carbon. It's also true that it's quite clear that there is a long-term dynamic of carbon, and an equilibrium is going to be reached at a point that no more carbon can be stored within the soil. And if we have a cow that grazes the land, it will still emit methane. Now, doing all the calculation at this stage, and with the methodology that we have, first is very laborious and should be assessed case by cases, and is always subject to a certain level of uncertainties, whether this balance is fully positive or fully negative. But this is a little bit something that we will try to address in several tasks of pathways, especially with 5.3, but also with regard to the method in 5.1. That was a little bit my comment.
Thank you. And I think, yeah, that's really good to hear. And obviously the challenge that we currently have with some of this work is that obviously it takes quite a while to measure changes in soil carbon. So farmers always say to me, oh, where's the evidence? Or, you know, has there been any research into that? I'm like, well, it's ongoing at the moment, and it probably takes, you know, like a 5-year period at least to see what that change has been. And then you have to go through a process of, you know, the actual kind of analysis and writing that up and getting that published. So yeah, it's interesting that I think it often feels, and I say this a lot, particularly on social media, that that farm practice is ahead of where the research is. But I think it's, you know, it's not academics' fault. It's the way that the processes work and the funding rounds work and all of those sorts of things. And I guess, you know, farmers are desperately wanting to see their systems tested in a way that actually replicates or demonstrates their system, as opposed to some sort of proxy that's been done on a computer somewhere by all you clever people. Damien, did you want to come in, and then Bill maybe?
No, very brief, but it was a little bit to stay on the monitoring and the assessment of the benefits of the practices, but beyond carbon. And so, like, widening the question on how do you measure benefits that can be other than carbon, on whether it's biodiversity, water, and social, especially on the social side. Do you have element to share on those points?
Laurence, do you want to talk about some of the SEEGSLIP work?
Yes, yeah, I think Lisa's can't join us unfortunately, but I think that will pick up on some of those aspects. Demi, I can try and summarise what SEEGSLIP is doing. So apologies in advance, people are probably sick and tired of listening to me present, but so I'll do my best to sort of do justice to the SEEGSLIP project. So can you see my screen, Nikki? Is that
Yep.
Yeah, it's in presentation mode. Okay. Yeah, thanks. So so SEEGSLIP was the project that we mentioned earlier, and it stands for Sustainable Economic and Ecological Grazing Systems, Learning from Innovative Practitioners, and this was our brilliant logo on the top right here, the acronym, and this was a collaboration between several organisations. You can see at the bottom of this slide. So it's led by Lisa, who works for UK CEH, but included Lancaster, SRUC in Scotland, the Organic Research Centre where I used to work, and Pasture For Livestock Association, as well as several other organisations who are more involved in a advisory capacity. But this was funded between several of the UK research councils, which was part of the Global Food Security Programme. And this initiative in particular was to sort of fund interdisciplinary research. And so hence the sort of holistic focus of SEEGSLIP and several other projects in the programme. But the research questions we were addressing in the project were these. So it's essentially looking at the sustainability of farmers within the PFLA, and in particular looking at interactions, trade-offs across ecological, social and economic domains, and also looking to identify the practices within the association and whether they can identify levers for change more generally within the livestock sector. And yeah, so the PFLA feels a bit strange talking about this with Nikki and Bill on the call, but this was a membership organisation that champions the unique regenerative role of ruminant animals in the grazed habitats that evolved alongside, and it was established as a CIC in 2011, and this figure's a little out of date now, but I think it was based on 2019 figures. There are over 500 farmers, which is retailers and consumers within the association. I think that's closer to 1,000 now, and there's a certification standard associated with the PFLA's practices as well. So the evolution of the PFLA is described in this paper by Vetter in the Journal of Rural Studies, but essentially the association began with a chance meeting conversation about grass-fed livestock at a transition farming conference back in 2009, and then there were a series of sort of milestones, if you like, along the development of the association, including the launching of a Google discussion group in 2010 that is extremely active still to this day, and then the launching of the Pasture For Life standards in 2015, and a massive uptake on social media and so on. So as I say, it led to 500 members in 2019, but it's closer to 1,000 now. So within the SEEGSLIP project, we were focused on a series of aspects. So they were all sort of nested within this systems approach. Essentially, we were looking at the agroecological condition of these farms in work package 2 through soil vegetation surveys as well as management surveys. And on the socioeconomic front, we were looking at economics of the farms as well as social perspectives and valuing of ecosystem services, as well as linking to consumer and meat quality aspects. And in work package 4, using the PG tool, we were looking at public goods and ecosystem service delivery and highlighting trade-offs, and as I say, all within this sort of holistic approach. So we for time. So yeah, so we were looking at 56 farms in the first year of the project, and you can see here the profile of the farms that we were assessing and the location across the UK, or GB, I should say, and primarily beef and sheep farms were included, and 70% were organic, and there was quite a range in the size of the farms. And in the second year of the project, we focused on a subset of 17 from that larger group, where we did some more detailed assessments, particularly through farmer interviews. So with the ecological evaluation in work package 2, we wanted to look at soil and vegetation parameters, and we used the countryside survey as a counterfactual for the PFLA farmers' grassland condition in particular. So the countryside survey is a large-scale sample that uses its last sample date was back in 2007, but it's a statistically robust sample that can allow us to look at typical condition of UK grasslands as a comparator to this group of pasture-fed livestock association-based producers. So it's a really useful data set in the context of this project. And Lisa was the manager of the countryside survey for many years, so hence we were able to get access to that data. So I'm not an ecologist, but I'm going to try and do justice to the results here in terms of the ecological condition. So what you can see here on this slide is the top left here, we can see the species richness within the CS improved. So that's the countryside survey data. So this large scale survey, you can see the plots from the survey on the right here. We use this as a comparator. And this improved grassland essentially means grassland that had been reseeded. So had new species, often lolium based, introduced. And then the neutral grassland was the sort of unimproved, so permanent grassland. And then the PFLA sample, so the 56 farms that we sampled on the right. So you can see here the total species richness when we compared to the CS samples was significantly greater within the PFLA compared to the improved grasslands. So with these newly seeded grasslands on the conventional countryside survey plots, we could see a significant increase in species richness, and also with forbs richness within the PFLA, there was a significantly higher number of forbs in those grassland fields on the PFLA farms. We didn't see any significant difference with regard to carbon concentration in this 1 to 15 centimetre horizon. So that was a point to note is that the CS, the countryside survey, only goes down to 15 centimetres. So we followed the same approach here for comparability, but we didn't see any significant difference at this sort of shallow sampling depth with regard to the PFLA compared to the CS neutral, so the permanent grassland and the improved plots. And one thing we did find was that the vegetation was significantly taller in the PFLA plots than in the CS improved and in the neutral grassland plots. And it was considerably taller. It wasn't just a small difference, there was actually a really substantial height difference in these PFLA plots. And that's really important for biodiversity because tall grass is really important for several key species, particularly with regard to invertebrates and vertebrate ecology. So that's a significant finding. You know, high grasslands we can see in several studies has been associated with improved biodiversity. So that was the ecology aspects, and apologies for the massive oversimplification. I'm not an ecologist, as I say, but hopefully Lisa can join us in a future seminar. On the socioeconomic assessments, we focused on a smaller set of the 56, as I say, in the second year of the project, and this focused on interviews, one-to-one interviews with the farmers, who highlighted in particular the importance of this Google group that I mentioned earlier for knowledge sharing, which is still very, very active in terms of farmers exchanging ideas and other members within the association engaging with that. And you can see here some of the quotes that were mentioned in the interviews, and in particular this totally welcoming aspect of the Google group that really makes newcomers feel that they're very welcome as part of this group and keen to people are keen to sort of exchange ideas with them. So key aspects of this relate to sort of generosity and trust and exchange of results and experiences through on-farm trials. The grazing practices were also assessed as part of this socioeconomic example. So only one of the farmers that were interviewed was intensively mob grazing as per the sort of Alan Savory approach. But several farmers were on a sort of mob grazing journey and applying sort of adaptive multi-paddock grazing approaches. And they were really expressing the enjoyment of experimenting with this innovative approach and sort of seeing the benefits directly through the observation of the animals, and also in terms of job satisfaction. So one of the key things that came out from the interviews was that farmers were really learning from each other and not waiting for policy support. So farmers within the association were being very proactive, not waiting for a lever post-Brexit to sort of encourage on-farm innovation, but sort of getting on with it on their own. On the more quantitative side, within the socio-economic evaluation work by SRUC, looked at the performance of the PFLA farmers relative to the Farm Business Survey. So it's the UK equivalent of the FADN. And so you can see in the blue the economic evaluation of the PFLA members, and in yellow the Farm Business Survey results. Now, what we could see was that for the gross margins per suckler cow, the PFLA farms performed better than the FBS lowland sucklers that you can see there in yellow on the right-hand side. And generally, when we looked at the reasoning, on the bottom chart, you can see the outputs. So the income that was being generated through the sales was considerably higher. This is often due to direct marketing that was taking place within the PFLA and on-farm processing on an added value. So interestingly, the variable costs were actually higher in many cases within the PFLA, but this obviously wasn't in relation to imported feed, but was more in relation to on-farm processing and also preventative veterinary medicine with regard to vet visits and herd health plans and so on. So there was more emphasis on that prevention aspect with regard to herd health and the associated costs. With the sheep on the economics, we could see there was less of a clear difference in terms of the gross margin per ewe. But interestingly, when we looked at the variable costs, we could see a considerable saving with regard to variable costs per ewe, and this was in particular related to the feed savings. Obviously, with a 100% pasture-fed system, there was no imported concentrate coming in. So we could see quite high variability across the sample, as well as you could see from the earlier charts, but there were high costs in the beef sector as a result of increased processing and marketing costs, but this also resulted in higher returns as a result of high prices, and there were less production inputs, in particular for sheep. So I'm just conscious of time, so I'll try and whiz through this next bit, but with the holistic assessment, one of the tools we used was fuzzy cognitive mapping. So we worked with the PFLA and with conventional beef farmers to identify the most central components of the system and how these elements interact. So through a focus group, we asked farmers within the PFLA to identify the most central aspects of their system from a farm management point of view and how those elements interact. And you can see here with this fuzzy cognitive mapping approach, we were able to identify the most central elements came out as vegetation management, in particular grass use efficiency and soil health. And when we repeated the same activity with conventional beef farmers, it was interesting to note that the most central elements that came out from these farmers were external to the farm. So things like climate change targets, amount of imported feed and